Hello, we want to pick up where we left off, and we were first, in terms of recapitulation, we were looking at the Great Depression, the causes of the Great Depression, and America's reaction to the Great Depression. In particular, the reaction of FDR's New Deal. We spent most of last week going through both his philosophy and the New Deal program itself. We concluded last week talking about the last program that was the largest of his New Deal programs, and that was the Emergency Relief Appropriations Act. And under that, you had clearly the largest work program in American history. This was not, as I pointed out, a relief program simply to provide people with money. It was a work relief program in which people were expected to work for the money they received for the government. Even, in fact, if it meant simply painting a mural on a post office wall, if it meant excavating digs at a Pueblo Indian reservation, or if it meant some odd 650,000 miles of road that were created by the New Deal, by this particular Works Progress administration. A massive program, as I indicated, that during its 8-year run, the Emergency Relief Appropriation Act spent more than $8 billion, primarily on the WPA. And as I indicated, that we still see, if we look around us, we can still see the legacy of the Works Progress administration. Simply go into 100 post offices at least in America, and you can see that they were either built by the WPA workers, the murals that have become really works of art now, right? Because many of these people who painted these murals were in fact out-of-work artists. Some of the best writers, the black writer Richard Wright, worked on the WPA writing guidebooks for tourists, travel books. And then actually some very outstanding scholarship came out of the WPA program, the 150-volume American series. That included, with actually a series on American life, that included one of, even today is considered, the most comprehensive catalog of slave narratives and slave testimonies of people who had actually gone through, had been slaves. And that still today is a great source of primary research for scholars today. An amazing program, an amazing period. The New Deal program was obviously extremely popular. But even though the New Deal program was popular while people were suffering during the Great Depression, one could detect that by 1937, after his re-election, that one could detect that perhaps the New Deal program had reached its peak. And there was the beginning now of some opposition to Roosevelt's ambitious second phase of his New Deal program that he was going to put into place between 1936 and 1940. But in truth, what really happens is that these grandiose plans for these new second round initiatives for his New Deal program really don't come to fruition. I think the high point of the New Deal was this WPA, the Wagner Act, and the Social Security Act. What we will find during his second term, there will be opposition to his New Deal program, and these plans will first begin to sputter, and actually they will be stalemated by the end of 1938. And I think there are reasons for that. It wasn't just the New Deal programs. Several things had happened between 1932 and 1936. While Roosevelt was an extraordinarily popular president and had created, in a sense, a new coalition, a coalition that eventually in the 40s and 50s will become known as the Civil Rights Coalition. A coalition of blacks who will, as we talked about, who will almost en masse as a population, will shift in 1936 from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. Secondly, we will see many intellectuals, particularly Jewish intellectuals, labor will support FDR. Farmers will support FDR. But in spite of this, and in spite of the fact that he will handily defeat his opponent, Alfred Landon, in the 1936 election, it is clear there is some rumbling within the Democratic Party by his second New Deal, particularly among Southern Democrats. Southern Democrats supported FDR's economic programs because, after all, many of them benefited directly from the New Deal programs. However, they were concerned about what they perceived as a disturbing trend within the Democratic Party. That there were two things that were happening within the party that they could not countenance, that they had to oppose. One was the shift in the way that New Deal programs were administered by the second New Deal. During the first New Deal, at the beginning, the administrative agency in the South was the already established state and local hierarchy. Okay, that is, during the first New Deal, the administrating agency was the state and local hierarchy. But there was a problem with having programs administered by the state and local hierarchy. And that problem was racism and discrimination. That this hierarchy that first administered the New Deal programs was the very same hierarchy that created a caste system in the South that was responsible for separate but equal. That doctrine established with Plessy. In other words, it was the very same people who segregated the South, who created dual school systems. It was, in other words, they were the Southerners who kept blacks in a second-class status, citizenship status. And they were not administering the programs fairly. We looked at the AAA, and we saw that besides poor whites who were tenant farmers who were pushed off the land by wealthy white landowners, that millions of blacks were pushed off the land and did not receive any benefits from the Agricultural Adjustment Act. You can look in the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. There too in the South, it was riddled with corruption and discrimination, excluding blacks from the benefits of the Civilian Conservation Corps. Virtually every program that was administered as a New Deal program in the South was discriminatory during the first administration. So what will happen toward the end of the first administration and clearly by the second administration was a shift from having these programs administered by the state and local hierarchy mechanism. That now the administration of these programs would be done from the federal level. And as Harold Ickes, who was head of the federal emergency relief programs and others, the Secretary of the Interior, he made it clear, Harry Hopkins as well, that there was not going to be any discrimination in the programs as long as they were in charge. This perception that somehow the federal government had usurped their privileged position angered Southern Democrats. They had intruded on what they considered their matter and how they conducted race relations in the South. I mean, it's interesting because a few years later you will have the president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, will travel to Birmingham, Alabama, for a conference sponsored by the Southern Conference on Human Welfare. She will sit with the black section in 1939. And a young Bull Connor in Birmingham, Alabama, this is in Birmingham, Alabama, a young Bull Connor who becomes famous later on when he gets older. We'll talk about that when we get to the Civil Rights Movement. But a young Bull Connor will tell the president's wife she cannot sit with the black delegates. Okay? And instead of, this is the president's wife. You think that she would be able to tell him, go fly a kite, but custom and tradition and these emotions were so strong in the South that even she had to at least bend. And instead of moving from the black section to the white section, she simply moved her chair in the middle between both. And that's where she attended. So plus, by that time, she had got a reputation, as we will see in a moment. She becomes one of the other reasons that Roosevelt begins to lose some popularity because she is associated. His wife is associated with pushing civil rights during Roosevelt's New Deal era. And in fact, I think there is validity in that. That Eleanor Roosevelt is not, it is not FDR who is an advocate, a strong advocate of civil rights. It is his wife. And for two reasons. He's a politician. He is a pragmatic politician. And when he becomes president in 1932, he understands that if he is going to get his bills passed, that he has to have the support of the Southern congressmen who control virtually every committee in Washington. As he once said, I mean, until I save the country, I can't, there's not much I can do about this other situation. Yes.
So she was associated with pushing for civil rights during the second New Deal?
Both, well, toward the, in 1932, she meets a black woman by the name of Mary Bethune, and she actually gives the First Lady a tutorial in race relations, because even she was a little bit naive about race relations. This black woman really educates Eleanor. And from that point on, she begins to push a civil rights agenda. And she was very effective because, unlike most first ladies, she had a lot of power. She had an ambit of power that was generally not accorded most first ladies. For instance, she could call her own press conferences. She had her own press corps. She had her own staff. And in fact, she had so much clout that it was during the second New Deal that she begins for the first time to get the black press wasn't even allowed during the first New Deal to even sit in on press conferences. They were excluded, as they had been excluded by Republicans. In fact, Herbert Hoover wouldn't even take a picture with blacks for fear that he would alienate Southerners. I mean, in fact, he even, during his campaign, he even made it clear, let me make this perfectly clear, that this is not the party of Abraham Lincoln anymore in 1928. So, I mean, this issue of courting the South, the so-called Southern strategy, was always very important, okay? So, and you couldn't ignore it. When Roosevelt becomes president, he buys a second home in Warm Springs, Georgia, not only because of the therapeutic steam baths there that supposedly help people recover from things like polio, which he had contracted, but it was also a shrewd political move on the part of Roosevelt. This man was no dummy. That's why he chose a Texan to be a vice president. He understood practical politics. And he even, once he bought the home in Warm Springs, Georgia, he announced that that Georgia was now his adopted state, which went over well, you know, I mean, as a politician. But by 1936, there were a lot of Southerners who were not buying that Georgia was his adopted state, nor was the South his adopted region. Because more and more he began to include new players into his administration that did not share the views of many Southerners. So what will happen is that with Eleanor Roosevelt pushing for civil rights, the poll tax, she pushed for a number of things, and with new players like labor, the South was never comfortable with organized labor, nor was the South ever comfortable with the number of Jewish Americans who became Democrats and very public in the Roosevelt administration. In terms of blacks in the New Deal, in the second New Deal, there were more appointed blacks, more blacks appointed to administrative positions in Roosevelt's administration than ever before in American history. And that too was a sign to Southerners somehow something was changing here, Southern Democrats. So many blacks became employed, became members of his administration, that they became known as the Black Cabinet. This didn't make a lot of Southerners happy at all. And they knew where to point the finger. It seemed to be Eleanor Roosevelt. And toward the end of the second administration, they made some pretty nasty accusations about the First Lady. I mean, they didn't like her at all. I mean, one rumor that was spread was that the reason she was so interested in pushing civil rights and was worried about equality so much was that she had some Negro blood in her, which accounted for it. Or if she didn't have any Negro blood in it, there were all kinds of whispering campaigns that said that she had a black lover. And as the word Negro was used then, a Negro lover, but today we would use the word a black or an African American lover. And that was spread, you know. She became the epitome of damn Yankeeism as far as Southern Democrats were concerned. And so what you have is a what? Is a fracture now within the Democratic Party. You have a schism within the Democratic Party. Two wings of the Democratic Party will now attempt to be able to cooperate. And at times, they were not able to. A liberal Democratic wing was forming, and the old conservative Democratic wing. And that created problems for Roosevelt doing his second New Deal. And because of this, many Southerners, in spite of what they felt was in their best interest, human nature sometimes tells us that we even go against what is best for us for emotional reasons. You know, the old saying that we will cut off our nose to do what? To spite our face. That Southerners began to oppose Roosevelt's bills, not because they were not needed in the Southern states, but because of their attitude and feelings toward Roosevelt. The Republicans seized this. And during the midterm elections in 1938, the Republicans seized this split, and they were able to make headway. They were able to capture a significant number of seats in Congress as a result of this split now within, this schism now within the Democratic Party. So much so that you could now, after 1938, you had a significant number of Republicans who could also now, along with these disfranchised Democrats, could block Roosevelt's legislation. And indeed, Roosevelt will even, as we will see, he will understand that the political climate has changed. For instance, when he runs for election in 1936, I pointed out that Roosevelt had moved to the left because of people like Coughlin, Townsend, and Huey Long Share Our Wealth program. He saw himself as a champion of the poor against the rich. In 1936, as I pointed out, he made a comment. He said that the forces of organized money are unanimous in their hatred for me. And I welcome their hatred. He ran this sort of radical campaign that he was going to redistribute the wealth, and he was going to, do battle with the forces of privilege, the aristocracy of wealth in America. And that that galvanized that section of the country to oppose Roosevelt too as well. So we see that during the second New Deal, which will also bring about, in a sense, a stagnation, and then eventually an end to the New Deal. Even Roosevelt, by 1938, after the midterm elections, we will see that he has gotten the message from conservative Democrats as well. He understands that he would not be able to pursue his original goals and plans during the second administration. So he will begin not to push New Deal legislation. For instance, he had promised he was going to push for greater improvements in the Social Security Act that he had passed in 35. He does not. He backs off of this. He knows simply he's not going to be able to get it passed, so he backs off of it. He does not push, for instance, to have the minimum wage increased any more than it was already increased by toward the end of 1938. In other words, he now accepts the political reality. There are certain things that he cannot do. Now, that was because of this opposition of the Southern Democrats, which gave rise and which gave an opportunity now for the Republicans to have some power. But there were other things that happened that Roosevelt himself did that didn't help his situation. And that turned Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, against Roosevelt himself. And that was the so-called court packing plan of 1936. 2 weeks after Roosevelt's inauguration, Roosevelt proposed what became known as the court packing plan. He proposed legislation that would increase the number of Supreme Court justices. The proposition was this, that every time an incumbent judge, Supreme Court justice, reached the age of 70. You know, Supreme Court justices can serve for life. I mean, you can carry them out in a box. You know what I mean? And which is what basically you do for most of them. You know what I mean? They basically will stay there until, well, it's a shame, but they until they virtually die, you know, in office. I mean, you know, but it's a lifetime appointment. I mean, look at one of the great Supreme Court justices, in my opinion, is Thurgood Marshall. I mean, he hung on as long as he could because of ideological reasons. He did not want to give it over to what he called the conservative interest in America. So he stayed there till he just had to carry him out, you know, virtually in his own casket. You know, he was so old. But so at 70, there were 6 Supreme Court justices in 1936 who were 6 out of 9 who were over 70. And they showed no indications that they were ready for retirement or that they were going to resign. This perhaps would not have been a problem if the justices had not increasingly been voting against some of Roosevelt's New Deal legislation. Okay? So what he would argue is that every time an incumbent refused to resign, that the president could appoint 1 justice for everyone over 70 that refused to resign, up until the court reached a maximum of 15 judges. Okay? Well, and Roosevelt argued publicly, he defended this. He said, I'm doing this because clearly the justices are overworked, that they are lagging behind in their caseload. Well, it may well have been just the opposite, that they were working too well because they were busily vetoing his legislation. And I don't think many people bought that argument, to be honest with you. And as a result, this was a rather ill-conceived plan on the part of Roosevelt to change something so cherished and so fundamental to American democratic institutions, and that was the Supreme Court, to meddle the executive meddling with the Supreme Court. So what will happen is that there is a backlash. Okay? There will be Republicans who will oppose it. There will be conservative Democrats who will oppose it, and even liberals who will oppose it because of its attack on the very constitutional structure of America. You know, that the president has no business interfering with this third branch of government. So what happens is that, and the bill does not pass, but it may well be that Roosevelt could have, had he used all of his political clout, perhaps he could have had some sort of bill passed to this effect, but the Supreme Court sort of cut the legs right out of Roosevelt's New Deal plan when they themselves began to change in how they ruled on certain decisions. This was particularly true of one judge, Supreme Court judge by the name of Owen Roberts. On two very important cases, this Supreme Court justice switched himself on the question of the Wagner Act, which was the constitutionality of collective bargaining, the Labor Act, which he switched and supported, which gave a narrow majority ruling the Wagner Act constitutional. And he switched again his vote to support the minimum wage that was before the court being decided whether or not it was constitutional or not. And he will support the constitutionality of both the Wagner Act and the Minimum Wage Act. So in a way, Judge Roberts' switching took some of the steam, or certainly made it very clear that it did not seem that it was necessary to tamper with the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court was working just fine. And indeed, when Roberts switches, you begin to have the court beginning to rule in favor of a number of New Deal programs after that. But the court packing plan itself left a bad taste in the mouth of many of Roosevelt's constituencies. Okay? Now, I think there's one other factor that will account for Roosevelt's lack of success during the Second New Deal, and that was the sudden recession that hit America, a relapse. So you had a relapse in the economy in 1937, plunging the employment rate back to Depression-era numbers. Okay? This relapse in the economy. There were many who blamed Roosevelt for the recession of 1937, and it went into 1938. Because Roosevelt believed, apparently, that the economy had turned around so much by 1937 that he could cut some expenses from the federal government. And indeed, he cut government spending. And some argue that cutting government spending was too premature, and it led to a relapse. It led to the recession of 1937 and 1937 to 38. And I should just point out that in the end, it was clear too that all the polls that were taken by 1938. That in the end, the American people had become less supportive of New Deal programs after 1937. And perhaps that was to be expected. Perhaps that's just human nature. As people began to resume, or as their lives regained some resemblance of normalcy again, as they were working, as they began to see themselves once again within the framework of being an American, most Americans were conservative to begin with, and only accepted these programs because it was a what? It was a great emergency. We talked about that this ingrained set of values that Americans don't look to the federal government to provide jobs. That is a function of the free enterprise system, is a function of capitalism, and is a function of individual initiative and industry. Well, many felt that we had moved to a point where those things could now what? Those things could now be re-engaged, and we didn't necessarily need these New Deal programs anymore. So there was clearly polls indicated that Americans had become more conservative on the issue of government-sponsored programs. Well, and Roosevelt, as I indicated, saw the handwriting on the wall and backed away. Backed away so much that we can say that by 1939, the New Deal was dead. Okay, it was dead. I was going to say something else. It wasn't in a coma, but it was dead. It didn't resurface. So what is the legacy then? I mean, we talk about the New Deal, and today, if you follow political debates, clearly one of the debates is that the direction the country has been going in is to dismantle the sort of New Deal mentality that came out of the 1930s, and that is the notion of big government over state and local control. Well, let me simply say this in terms of what Roosevelt's legacy was. I think clearly, though, and while people may criticize and may argue for a new sort of federalism and smaller big government, that Roosevelt forever changed the relationship between the people and the national government. That in spite of who is in office, the federal government continues to grow. Those who will criticize and those who will ask for a smaller government over the years, the contradiction of that is that while they're advocating a smaller government, the return to, again, state and local control, the federal government has simply gotten bigger. And the reason for this, I think, is not that people like big government. It is simply that we found out during the Great Depression that with the way the country was constructed and interrelated and had become so urbanized, and the problems were so much bigger, that essentially states and local governments do not have the power to handle problems on a national level. There are simply some things that the state and local governments are impotent to be able to handle. And that is why the federal government continues to remain so large. You cannot go back to a period of time. I mean, this was the debate in 1912, was it not? Woodrow Wilson wanted to return America to an America of Thomas Jefferson. Well, that was impractical. You simply cannot go back as America became more and more industrialized and less rural and agrarian. The problems became simply too large. And as a result of the Great Depression and the New Deal, people, and certain groups in particular, look to the federal government for help. Okay? They don't look to the states. Because after all, it wasn't the states that passed a Social Security Act that provided benefits for the elderly, unemployment benefits, the benefits to dependent children. It was the federal government. It was the federal government, not the states. So the states essentially had been hostile to labor because the states are far more controlled by the interests of big business. Okay? So it was the federal government that supported labor, at least in terms of the legislation that was passed. And it's national. It cuts across regions and state lines. So I think simply the realities, the complex realities of modern America made it difficult. Although we hear the rhetoric and it sounds nice to want to go back, but there's also groups who don't want to go back to a time where the states and local governments control the greatest source of money and wealth. And they're minorities. Minorities don't have an inherent distrust of state and local governments. And the reason is obviously because of the history of discrimination and racism that came from the states and local government. That's why you always seem to have minorities supporting large government more than the majority, because they have always felt, whether this is true or not, or they've always felt that they could find a fairer, a more leveler playing field on the federal level than they could on the state level, and that a return to a state control or local control hierarchy, as they are still a minority population, would work to their disadvantage. Now, whether that's true or not, that mentality, I think, persists today. So I think that is why. Some have argued, I think, and isn't really true, that the New Deal altered the distribution of power. If you look at statistics, I don't think that's really, if it did, it was insignificant. I think, for instance, in 1929, the top 5% of Americans received 30% of all of the income in America. That 5% of the American population, that's about what it is today too, that 5% of the American population received 30% of all the income. In fact, it may be even more today. I mean, if you look at these statistics. But by 1938, the top 5%, it had decreased to 26% as opposed to 30. So, I mean, it's hard to argue that 4% indicated any real significant redistribution of wealth, as some scholars have argued. I don't agree with it. I think that the people who probably benefited the most in terms of change was the middle class. The middle class will emerge out of the New Deal stronger and will continue to grow in America. It changes very little, however, for people who were poor before the Depression. They would be poor after the Depression as well. So it doesn't change anything much for people who are in poverty. Well, but I think this whole thing that Roosevelt remains one of the most popular presidents in American history. Now, we also must point out that in the end, it was not his New Deal programs that brought America out of the Great Depression. That recession of 1937, 1938, it would be World War II that would bring America out of, finally out of the Great Depression. It would be the World War II and orders from Allies that now begin to stoke the American factories as they had done during World War I. So we can't give Roosevelt credit for ending the Great Depression, but he certainly helped people through one of the darkest periods in American history. Well, let's look now. Let's go back, and I want to trace or to look at foreign policy up and including World War II. But I may even want to go even further than that. I may want to look at foreign policy in the post-World World War II period, that is through the Cold War, and look at some important issues that I think bear on American society today, particularly the evolution of American and Cuban foreign policy. And so I may simply go straight through to discuss, that, and then go back to look at domestic policy after World War II. But let's look at the evolution of American foreign policy. The first thing we should note is that America emerges from World War I as an undisputed world and major power. But most Americans did not know. There was no unanimity among Americans or American statesmen as to how to use that new status as a world power. There was no consensus. In fact, there was great ambivalence, as there was in domestic policy. There was a great deal of disillusionment. We talked about that with World War I, with the way that the war ended. They were disillusioned, not only that, but they were disillusioned with their own leaders who had failed to get America in the League of Nations and to even sign the Treaty of Versailles at that point. This ambivalence we see during the 1920s. We see America trying, groping toward some reconciliation, some understanding of their new status now as a world power. It is clearly a major economic and military power in the world. And yet, there was still this persistent strand of isolationism that was very strong among the American people. As one contemporary, one statesman put it, he said that most Americans cared more about the grade of highway construction in Los Angeles than they did about who became the new Prime Minister of France. In other words, they could care less about foreign policy. In the end, I think you have a sort of a combination. On the one hand, you have a policy that emerges that is less a strict policy of isolationism. It is not a hard, strict policy of isolationism. It sort of becomes a policy of independent internationalism. Okay, let me repeat that again. The policy that will emerge during the 20s. In spite of this isolationist sentiment, it will not be strict isolationism, but what we will see will be a kind of independent internationalism on the part of the American government. Now, I should point out that there are scholars who argue that this policy of independent internationalism and the overtones of isolationism may well be responsible for World War II. That this policy was extraordinarily short-sighted and impractical. They argue that the U.S. should not have kicked the fruits of victory of World War I simply under the peace table. That is, that the failure of America to sign the treaty and to particularly join the League of Nations crippled the League of Nations from the beginning. There was a cartoon that I once saw in a book that was this table which supposedly had 4 legs to it, but one was missing, and that was the American leg. And the table tipped over and fell because the Americans were not there to support the League of Nations. But it wasn't just the American refusal to join the League of Nations that would ultimately bring about World War II. It was also the spineless and I call it spineless, but it was the refusal of the Allies to act when they saw events in Europe taking place that clearly indicated that at some point the handwriting would be on the wall. That they are just as responsible. Well, but the Europeans criticized the Americans very early in the 1920s. I mean, they expected the U.S. to be there. The French, the English. But as one foreign minister put it, every time we look across the Atlantic Ocean to see the great American eagle, all we see is the butt of an ostrich with his head in the sand. That is what one foreign minister said about America. He said that America wanted world peace, but was unwilling to pay the price for world peace. Harding himself, as we will see, was totally uninterested in foreign policy. He would instead, as we will see, that he will put Charles Evan Hughes he will become his Secretary of the State. But when someone asked Warren G. Harding what did he feel about the situation in Europe, and Harding said, he scratched his head and said, I don't know anything about this European stuff. I mean, that's exactly what he said. I don't know anything about this European stuff. And left foreign policy almost exclusively, as I indicated, in the hands of Charles Evans Hughes. But, so Harding shunned the League of Nations. He wasn't interested. But the U.S. did, though, on an unofficial, let me point out that there were those who felt the U.S. had to be somehow tied to this body. So the U.S. would get involved in the World Court of the League of Nations. Okay? But it was always careful to distinguish their involvement in two ways. One, their involvement was only as in a consultation capacity, a consultant capacity. And secondly, they only got involved in non-political issues that involved the World Court. For instance, they would get involved in the question of opium traffic in the world. They got involved in conferences that dealt with white slavery, the problem of white slavery. And they got involved with, in the World Court, when issues that dealt with international labor standards. But they did not get involved, they said, in direct political events taking place in Europe. As one person again, was one contemporary again put it, our foreign policy seems to be that we won't belong to anything, but we are perfectly willing to butt in on everything. That is the idea the U.S. wants to have its cake and eat it too. But actually, there were those who wanted the U.S. to become a full member of the World Court. There were always those, Charles Evans Hughes pushed, and we'll see others, who would push between 1921 and 1935 to have the U.S. become an official member of the World Court. But in 1935, the last vote, they had been trying off and on, and the last vote to get America officially in the World Court would happen in 1935, and it would be defeated by people like Huey Long, Father Coughlin, but most importantly, a blind senator from Minnesota who shouted on the floor, "To hell with Europe and the rest of those nations. We don't want to be a member of the World Court." His view prevailed, and the U.S. did not become a member of the World Court. So what we really have is a more modest goal then. The U.S. can't become officially involved in the covenant of the Treaty of Versailles because it's not a signatory. It can't be officially involved in the World Court. So it now has to develop, again, its own policy of independent internationalism. What does this mean? The goal then of independent internationalism, the goal would be to limit the possibilities of war by non-military means. To limit the possibilities of war by non-military means. That the U.S. would use treaties, it would use conferences to bring about what they considered most important, and that was disarmament. That the the one way to do this would be conferences, treaties, to bring about this armament. The second would be to use its economic power too, as well, as we will see the second part of this goal. Okay, so to achieve world stability, they would conduct these disarmament conferences to reduce the arms race. Remember, that was one of who warned about this, and this is why I think it's so interesting. We talked about it. Who warned about the arms race? And one of his 14 points was to make sure that we did not have, I mean, Wilson's 14 points in hindsight, it's scary because he was so accurate about what conditions would create a second war. And that his 14 points were directed at removing these conditions that would precipitate a second war. And one was clearly disarmament. Okay? Because the arms race, he observed, had been one of the major reasons for World War I. And then the other things that he talked about as we go along. Wilson was very prescient on these issues in his 14 points. Unfortunately, the U.S. is bungling, and Wilson's own role in it. If the U.S. had been a player from the beginning, an active player, perhaps, I mean, it's always, hindsight is what? There's always 20/20, but it would have been interesting to see if history would not have been different had the U.S. been able to force the Allies to adhere to his original 14 points instead of decimating the treaty after he came back and did not get support from the Republican Party and because of his own recalcitrance. Well, secondly, first disarmament through conferences and treaties. Secondly, they would create world stability, protect American national interests, by expanding American economic influence. In other words, they would use American economic influence to create world stabilization and further American national interests. That was the second part of the two goals. The first objective would be to bring about disarmament through conferences and treaties that we'll talk about, and the second was that the U.S. would use its superior economic situation to bring about world stabilization, and we'll see how they do this. Well, Hughes, let's talk about Charles W. Hughes, because he will spearhead the attempt to achieve the first of these goals, and that is disarmament. Charles W. Hughes, the progressive, was a patient and pragmatic diplomat as Secretary of State. He was very conservative and placed a great deal of respect. He had a great deal of respect for international law and treaties signed under international law to maintain the peace. So he wanted treaties because he had this great respect for international law, and that if you could create or sign treaties under international law, they would be respected, they could be used to create and maintain peace. Now, he believed that America could not simply retreat, as the isolationists wanted them to, completely from their responsibility. But that the U.S. could, in fact, establish what he called a Pax Americana by using American both economic power and what he called American persuasive power, to create a Pax Americana, an American peace. Well, this would be maintained by America's dominant economic position in the world. And look at America's economic system. Now, what he's talking about is creating a new international economic system that all these countries will buy into, which the U.S. would control. It's almost, in some ways, it sounds familiar to what, it sounds a little bit like sort of dollar diplomacy, but it's not quite the same. But it's using the economic power to determine foreign policy. Well, I mean, look at America. I mean, after World War I, the U.S. produced 70% of the world's petroleum and 40% of the world's coal. What is interesting is that history is also changing because of one product, one natural resource that will be the source of great tension and great anxieties between countries, and that will be oil. Oil, in fact, it was American oil, and America had to really dig deep in its own oil reserves during World War I to keep the Allied navies afloat. It was said that it was American oil that floated the Allies to victory during World War I. That oil had become an extraordinarily important commodity in international politics. Because what had happened was that you had a technological change in ships. Ships went from coal burning, wood burning, to oil burning ships during World War I. Until World War I, in fact, oil was only used as a lubricant. But by the end of World War I, modern navies were built on oil. Now, this conversion created a kind of aggressiveness on the part of countries to make sure that they had what? Access to the world's oil fields. The British and the French recognized how much they depended on oil during World War I. So immediately after the war is over, they will use their muscle with the League of Nations to get the League of Nations to grant them a monopoly, France and Britain, a monopoly on the gigantic oil fields, pools of oil in the Middle East, particularly in Palestine and Mesopotamia. They were extraordinarily lucrative pools of oil. The French and the English sort of browbeat the League of Nations to give them a virtual monopoly on oil in this part of the world. So much so that by 1919, the British had cornered half of the world's known oil reserves as a result of this mandate from the League of Nations. Now, it should be pointed out that there were other countries unhappy about this. Okay? And this would be one of the seeds for World War II as well. Even Wilson didn't like it. Wilson understood that while we had reached deep into our own oil reserves, he also understood the vast pool of oil that existed in the Middle East, and that the U.S. should not be cut out of this group that had gotten this monopoly in Palestine and Mesopotamia and the Middle East to these oil fields. So Wilson will begin. He won't be successful, but he will begin a process of the U.S. badgering the League of Nations, badgering the French and the Germans, French and the English, to let them in, to give them a voice in parceling out the oil reserves and fields in the world. By 1928, Charles Evan Hughes is successful in getting America admitted into this extremely important Middle East oil combine with the French and the British. Now keep in mind, the U.S. had its own oil, but the U.S. still understood that you could never have enough oil. I mean, as the British put it, that oil had become so necessary, that oil was as necessary as blood in the battles of tomorrow. In 1919, the British said that oil had become as necessary as blood in the battles of tomorrow. And he was absolutely right. Between 1925 and 1929, these countries would dominate most of the oil reserves in the world. France, England, and America. But America, it wasn't just oil, but American commerce in general had a catalytic effect over the world. I mean, everything from ITT to RCA to the Associated Press, America was an economic global giant that carried with it weight and influence with these countries. In many ways, the American culture in the post-World War I period by many countries was looked upon as a superior culture because of its economic power. Indeed, as one person put it, there is only one first-class civilization in the world today, and that is the United States. Well, let's look at several treaties that were designed to eliminate the arms race, but in the process would expose the potential players who would help bring about World War II. So, what you would have in late 1921 would be Charles Evan Hughes calling for a conference on disarmament in Washington. Hughes was aware that even as the war ended, one of the participants in World War I would give the U.S. trouble in the future. And this was Japan. Okay? Japan had never really been a full-fledged member of the Allied coalition. It was clear that the Japanese, and we'll look at the Japanese, in fact, when we return, we're going to look at the Japanese, maybe a short history lesson in terms of where the Japanese come from and why they are so aggressive and expansionist during the first part of the 20th century and all the way into World War II. But he was aware that the Japanese had only joined the Allied cause to further their own expansionist ambitions. as soon as the war was over, the Japanese quickly moved to consolidate their gains. For instance, they immediately grabbed the German possessions in the Pacific. They grabbed the islands of the Marianas, the Carolines, and the Marshall Islands. They would do some other things too that would upset the U.S. and that would at least make the Americans aware that the Japanese were potential problems. We'll look at that when we meet next time.